Hey, this is episode 1 of the UFC Cutting Room Floor. I'm Zane Simon of Bloody Elbow. Um, I've been following the UFC roster for like 5 years now, really closely, ever since I started the current list of UFC fighters over on Wikipedia, a project which I've long ago since left behind for a similar version over on Bloody Elbow, but it's still something that I've been keeping track of for a long time now because, frankly, keeping track of the UFC roster using their tools is almost impossible. Their website is sort of an unnavigable morass of forgotten data and unupdated roster points and really just poorly tracked from beginning to end. To the point that somebody's even started a Twitter handle that just tracks UFC roster changes. So all that is why I've been kind of keeping track on my own of all their cuts, of all of their signings, of all the divisional movements, all that kind of stuff, just because it's almost impossible otherwise just to know who's fighting and who's fighting where. I mean, when you have a roster now of 534 fighters, it's just impossible for the average fan to keep track of that and keep it all up to date. So that's something I've been doing for a long time now, and that's why now the UFC is suddenly on a monthly cutting schedule. They've been kind of just doing it haphazardly for years, and just this year, it seems like every time the first of the month rolls around, they are releasing a bunch of cuts. Now, of course, when I say releasing, I don't mean publicly announcing or making that apparent in any distinct way, shape, or form. I mean that they are quietly in the dead of night updating their website, and somebody who's kind enough to scrape it for data and put it on a Twitter account is publishing those updates. So to that extent, I don't know, to that extent, take this with a grain of salt. I have not personally talked to all of these fighters to confirm that they have been released. Usually getting cut is something fighters do not like to talk to at all. Fighters would probably rather talk about their most embarrassing, training moments than they would talk about their UFC release. So it's just one of those things that it's kind of unfortunately, it's not like other big sports where the team just keeps a really up-to-date public roster of who's on and announces who's made the team, who hasn't, who's playing this position, who's in reserve, all that. We're not there. So this is information I'm 99% sure of. If, if I'm wrong about some of it, then that's great for the fighter. Thank God they didn't get cut. They can they can live with the fallout of people asking, "Hey, did you get cut for a few days?" and being able to say, "No, I didn't. I still have my job and I'll be fighting next month or whatever." But as it's most likely not the case, I'm just going to plow ahead and assume that they are gone. This month, the UFC did a lot of cleaning house on their flyweight roster. Kind of a surprising amount. They cut 5 flyweights along with 5 other fighters. In general, for them to cut 10 fighters in a month is a pretty high number. It's something they've tended over the years to... I guess over the past couple of years, they've cut a lot less fighters than they've signed, which is why the roster's gone from like 250 fighters to 550 fighters. But that's over like the past 4 or 5 years it's done that. But they've now over the past year or so, they've been cutting about as many fighters as they've signed. And now what we're seeing is almost sort of a point of contraction. Over the last month, they signed about 6 fighters, maybe a couple more, and they've cut 10. So we can see that they are not just losing as many as they're gaining, but maybe a couple beyond that as well. As I say, this is all flyweights. The big name here for this month is Tim Elliott. He was the 12th. He's still currently the 12th or 13th ranked flyweight for the UFC because their ranking system is capable of dropping Nate Diaz on a whim, but not capable of keeping up with their own internal roster moves, which, whatever. Less said about that, the better. But Tim Elliott, he's on a 3-fight losing streak, all to pretty top competition in the UFC. It's losses to other ranked fighters, Zach McCoskey, Joseph Benavidez, Ali Bagatinov. Benavidez and Bagatinov have both gotten title shots. McCoskey's made steady improvement. It's a tough run. But at the same time, he's lost every time he's taken a step up in competition, including a debut loss to John Dodson. And his wins are over guys, especially with Luis Gagno now, who are no longer in the UFC, the other one being Jared Papazian. It's an unfortunate cut. It feels a bit premature, but it's also, I don't know. It's not the worst cut they've made, certainly. I mean, it's not like the Jake Shields or the Yushin Okami or the John Fitch cuts where they are just obviously sending a message, we don't want this boring fighter. Tim Elliott, somebody who continues to struggle and it seems is not making the right adjustments in his game. He's got an awkward style that is just not improving over time. It even just seems to be getting less competitive in some ways. So I can't say I'm terribly surprised, but he's a guy I think will be back really soon. He's only been fighting for about 6 years now. He doesn't have the kind of mileage on him where I think he's just going to get cut and then lose a bunch. He should probably go out, win on the regional scene, and be able to come back. The other flyweight cuts, Luis Gagno, somewhat similar position, also been fighting for about 6 years, has lost to Kyoji Horiguchi and Tim Elliott with a win over a no contest over Phil Harris that got overturned, and I believe for a failed drug test, I want to say, was the reasoning behind that. And he's has a sort of career-defining win over John Lineker, but he just hasn't, like Elliott to some extent, he's a fighter that hasn't really seemed to make any adjustments in his game in the UFC. Isn't getting more competitive as time goes on, but is also a guy I could see coming right back. Shane Howell is a quick cut for the UFC. He's an 0-2 flyweight along with Tateki Matsuda. Both of those guys are guys that the UFC just kind of brought in to test. They didn't win either of their first 2 fights and are gone now immediately. Shane Howell's not a guy that I would necessarily expect back in the UFC just because his problem seemed to be that he was just drastically physically overwhelmed. Really not somebody who was competing with the fighters he was in there with, much more in a survival mode constantly. And that, that's somebody who, and he's also been fighting for a couple of years longer. So he's a bit later in his career, struggling physically in the UFC. He's maybe not a guy who's going to get right back in there. Tateki Matsuda, I'm a little sad to see him go. I mean, he's not a big name, not somebody that fans are going to recognize, but he's a longtime veteran of the Northeast fight circuit, which I tend to believe puts together a lot of really polished, underrated, talented fighters. He's also been fighting, for a little while. Not, he's still around that 6-7 year career. I mean, all these guys are within that same range. So I don't want to say like any guy's way past his prime or anything like that, but Matsuda, he's got an extra year on his career. And his problem seemed much more in the UFC to be a process problem where he's got a lot of the physical tools. He's got some really competitive areas, but he's just not a consistent fighter. He doesn't strike with any consistency. He doesn't wrestle with any consistency. He doesn't grapple with any consistency. He's a good athlete, but nothing quite clicks. His last loss to Joey Sanchez was really competitive, but Sanchez isn't exactly he's a developing talent, but it's not somebody that the UFC's put a lot of stock in either. It's not like he was losing to top guys. So can understand that. I don't know that we're going to see him back in the UFC, but it's kind of a rough cut. Like maybe of all the fighters on here, Taki Matsuda's the guy I would have most liked to see get another shot, even though Elliott's a much bigger name. I think Matsuda was fun and had some promise, and just he was improving, but 0-2 and he's out. The other flyweight being who got cut is Alptekinaz Kilic. He's also a guy that really did seem to be improving, but it was sort of a classic case of a wrestler improving his boxing at the cost of his wrestling. The better boxer he became, the less he wrestled, and he wasn't able to become a good enough boxer to really survive on his hands alone. In his last fight, especially, he came in against Ben Wen, somebody who was, looked like a prime fighter for Oz Kilic to beat, just to out wrestle, grind down, and Oz Kilic just tried to stand and trade with him the whole time, and went in against a much bigger puncher and got knocked out and made 3 straight losses for him. Not surprised to see him gone. He is exceptionally early in his career and does seem to be improving, so he is somebody I could see coming right back on another couple of wins, but he needs to figure out what he's trying to do in the cage, it feels like, at least to me. I mean, that's kind of a lay perspective from the outside, but it just seems like a guy who has found himself stuck between styles, trying to transition from wrestling to grappling and or wrestling to boxing and caught in the middle. Let's see, other fighters that got released. From going up the divisions here, women's bantamweight, Shayna Baszler. That's not a cut I'm surprised at all. Like Shane Howell, she's somebody that just hasn't been physically competitive in the UFC at all, and is very late in her career, all things considered. Not when did Shayna Baszler start fighting? I'm gonna have to look this up really quick, but she started fighting back in 2003, so she's 12, 13 years into her pro career now, and very few fighters fight that long, so it's kind of not surprising that she's not really, in the mix anymore, and is, like I said, she just hasn't had the physical chops to fight against UFC competition. So not only is she gone, but it's hard to see her coming back. Couple of featherweights got cut. Rocky Lee and Alex Torres, both international tough season competitors. Both guys cut at 0-1, got a introductory UFC fight, lost it, they're gone. They're usually the kind of fighters that are just not going to come back that may not even be good regional talents, that may just go out and struggle on the regional scene either, or as well. Underdeveloped talent, especially international scenes, you find a lot of fighters that are good athletic talents, but really underdeveloped skill-wise, or are reasonable skill talents and really not physically capable fighters. Torres and Lee definitely falling right into that category. Up to welterweight, they also released Vic Gruzic, another international tough competitor. Gruzic's one of those fighters, I think some people hoped that he would show a little more in the UFC, but not only was he just really kind of seems like a slow fighter physically, I mean, not like slow mentally, that would be cruel, but he just was really one-dimensional. Really, like, the only thing he did was infighting, clinch boxing, dirty boxing, and without that, I mean, especially in this fight against Brendan O'Reilly, every time the fight wasn't in the phone booth, Vic Gruzic was losing that fight. And you can't, it's hard to survive when you're that one-dimensional in the UFC. It's just, there's not a lot of room for guys who only do one thing well. And even then, like, competitively, he wasn't, a savant in the clinch. He was just a decent, dirty boxer. He hasn't been fighting that long. He's probably going back to the Australian regional scene, which is not that deep, so it would not be hard to see him putting together a win streak and coming back for another regional Australian card. But he's also almost 40, so all those things weighed together, it's hard to know how long he's going to keep in the game. Oftentimes you see guys get cut like that, and it's just kind of like, no, I'm going to move on to other stuff. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised to see Gruzic back in the UFC in the near future, but I also wouldn't be surprised to see him just kind of not in MMA that much longer. And finally, another Australian cut. or Aussie regional scene cut. I think Gruzic's actually from New Zealand, but Dylan Andrews also got the cut, and or maybe I get those flags reversed. I think Dylan Andrews is the New Zealander, and Vic Grujic is the Australian. But Andrews got cut as well, yeah, and that's kind of sad to me. I don't know, like, he's another guy who has been around a lot longer than you'd think, been fighting since 2006, older than he seems too, at 35. Probably his losses, he's on a 3-fight losing streak, probably the result of just kind of getting a bit shop worn. But seemed like a fighter who really had the physical tools to compete, but never got quite, maybe wasn't with a big enough camp early enough in his career, didn't get the right training. Those physical tools never quite translated into consistent MMA performances. So it's too bad. He seemed like a fighter who did have the physical ability to hang in the UFC, but just kept losing, kept making weird mistakes in fights and losing in some of the most random ways. Threw himself on his own head against Sam Alvey, dove into a submission against Brad Scott, got injured against Clint Hester. So I'm not surprised Andrews is back. I would be very surprised if he came, or Andrews is gone. I would be very surprised if he came back, unfortunately. And that's really, I'm not going to go into a lot more depth here just because, I don't know, it's a one-man show. It'd be weird to drag this on too long. But only other fighter to get released in the past month is Mark Munoz, who I guess didn't get released, but he's retired. So not a lot of in-between movement off the UFC roster. It's usually just going to be the first of every month. So this is going to be a monthly show. And that's pretty much the long and short of it. So thanks for hanging out and checking out the first episode with me. Feel free to tweet at me at @TheZaneSimon and suggest ways that I could change the show. I might try and get some guests commentate at some point, come in, drop by, depending on how well I can schedule things. I'd be up to add more things, talk maybe about some of the new signings the UFC's made as well. Recently, they haven't, that's a pretty slow thing too. And just, feel free to tweet at me, tell me what I can improve at @TheZaneSimon. Find me on Bloody Elbow. And thanks for watching, everybody.